Yes, I do identify as a European, and I think growing up, I started identifying myself as a European almost by default. I grew up in a small village in northeastern Italy, um, where my name sounded really foreign. I'm a one-fourth Sicilian, and my surname comes from there, and it's not known at all in um, that region of Italy where I grew up. And my first name is a biblical name that is very rare in Italy. And also my appearance, however weird that sounds, um, is not how a northeastern Italian is supposed to look like. So growing up, I was told constantly that um, I I did not look like someone coming from there, that my name was not from there, if I was even Italian at all. And because of that, I think almost unconsciously, but from very early on, I um, I thought of myself as European as a way of evading the provincialisms of Italian identity. And then the ironic thing is that when I moved to the UK and I would tell people that I was Italian, no one had ever any doubt that I was Italian, that I belonged there, which made me think about what different perceptions people have of um, identity and certain countries, and what someone is supposed to look like or do to belong there. And yeah, it's endlessly fascinating. Um, I think my answer is going to be a bit different from others that are up on the website, in the sense that um, I can't really think of one moment I experienced in Europe that was formative for me. But growing up in Italy, you spend a lot of time with your grandparents, and I also spent a lot of time with my grandma, and she used to tell a lot of stories about her life, and also about the war, the Second World War. Um, and From very early on in these stories, again, almost unconsciously, but I would compare a lot what she was telling me about her experience of Europe and my experience of Europe, and her experience of Italy and my experience of Italy. And there was no doubt that my experience was not even comparable to hers. Um, and hearing these stories growing up about an ordinary girl like you, about the same age like you, late childhood, early teenage years, growing up in the same village like you, but um, going through war, going through dictatorship, going through the worst kind of nationalism, is really formative. It was really formative for me. It's something that just sticks with you for the rest of your life. And because of that, I think there's such almost a desperate strive in you to protect those freedoms that Europe has achieved. And sometimes I find myself thinking about, if one day I have children of my own, how I'm going to teach them um, to appreciate these same freedoms and values without that background, without that generation um, telling that story. Yeah, I guess that's part of the challenge. Um, there are a few, unfortunately, but I think the worst for me was the migrant crisis of 2015. Um, Seeing us as Europeans turning our backs on these people crying for help and dying in some of the most atrocious circumstances was simply shameful. I think there's no sweeter way of putting it. It went against the basic principles of the European Union, that the current phrase, um, it will never happen again, in reference to the events of the 1940s, was really a big contrast to what was happening that summer, I thought. But also the um, long Christian tradition that has defined European identity for the past 2000 years, regardless of whether you're religious or not. That was also a big contrast. And more generally, I thought that the failure of the European Union to deal with the crisis responsibly led to a rise in a new wave of populism. And of course, populism is never caused by just one problem, but the failure to tackle the migrant crisis was certainly an important reason. And I thought that was really irresponsible on the part of the European Union to allow that to happen. And more generally, also, for the European Union as an institution to be successful, I think it's not enough to tackle problems, but it's also important to foresee problems in order to stop them or prevent them from escalating and reaching a climax. And if the European Union wants to survive and be successful in the future, I think being able to tackle problems before they escalate is certainly a good way to go. Um, I thought a lot about it, and I think I have to. One is the Schengen Agreement of 1995, and the second one is the introduction of the euro in 2002. And I know many people would disagree with me, especially in Britain, but I think for me, both events brought Europeans closer together, and it allowed us to go beyond some of the ugly tenets of 20th century nationalism, borders, passports, questionings, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany, when one of the consequences was the reaffirmation of the centrality of the nation state to European identity. So for me, Schengen and then the euro were a sort of breath of fresh air that allowed us to move towards a healthier way of embracing national identity. And then I think on a more personal note, I remember in 2002 when the euro was introduced, I was about 6, 7, and um, I was learning to count money, and it was really hard for me because the Italian currency before the euro, the lira, you counted money in the thousands, and for a child that is really difficult. So I remember when the euro came in, that as a 7-year-old, I could count coins as like 1, 2, 3 rather than in the thousands. And I remember thinking that I thought Europe was making my life much easier. I think definitely freedom of movement and freedom of work. It's really defined my adult years, and my life would be very different today without those privileges. I left Italy for Britain when I was 18. So it really defined my adulthood. Um, and I think because of that, because it's so personal, so close to home, it's it's even more heartbreaking to see that now this is taken away from us here. Um, but I also know that I'm one of the lucky ones because I have a European passport, so I can still enjoy the same rights in all the other member states. Um, but when I hear some um, British ministers claiming that um, um, that curtailing their own citizens' freedoms in Europe is a form of regaining British freedom, of taking back control. I find it rather grotesque, but again, I'm on the lucky side. So I think if there's one thing that was certain in this uncertain year, was that we only have one life and we only have one planet. So I hope that in the next 10 years, the European Union will work towards protecting and respecting both of them. So I think that I hope it will work seriously towards solving the migrant crisis and the climate crisis. And I know that these two issues are quite different and need to be tackled with different policies. But I also think that at the core, the solution is the same, and that is one word, and that's integration. When it's kind of sort of, the final goal, something to pinpoint. And when it comes to the climate crisis, of course, we need to move towards a greener economy, reduce carbon emissions, reduce the use of plastic. But we also want to improve infrastructure. We want to bring people closer together with better means of transport, providing everyone with access to the internet or Wi-Fi. And I think one thing that the European Union should do in this respect is to make sure that it links together, it connects together, not only the centres, but also the peripheries, because we know that when people are left behind, that's when problems start. And also, incidentally, the Earth is round, so geographically, there's no such thing as a periphery. That's very much a state of mind. That's something to keep in mind as well. And when it comes to the migrant crisis, I think the question is not just a redistribution of refugees across the European continent equally, although that's a good start. But it's also a question of giving them opportunities to do well, to rebuild their own life, to have a dignified life, to have hope for the future for themselves and their children, and ultimately to integrate. So yes, integration, I think for me, in all different forms would be key in the next 10 years. And another thing that I think is important, perhaps less important to many, but I guess it's important to me because that's what I work on. I think the European Union should have a serious talk with all its member states, as well as among themselves, about the meaning and future of such words as such notions as nations and nation states, nationhood, nationalism, minority nationalisms, and regionalisms. These are problems that keep coming back, have kept coming back in recent decades, and they will not go away. Brexit has shown that, if anything, it exacerbated these problems. I don't think that the European Union, as it stands, is ready to face any issues related to national identity. But I think it should, because so far responses have not been up to the job. And again, burying your head in the sand is not going to make problems go away. So I hope serious talks will happen, and the next time that questions about national identity arise, the European Union will be up to the job and will have the answers. I think it's a complicated relationship, and well, it's a complicated relationship because nations are not something natural. They're not something predestined. Of course, across the history of the world, people have always felt some forms of attachment to um, whatever local or less local institutions. But the modern nation as a political entity linked to the nation state, so a bounded territory, linked to traditions, linked to a common history, common symbols, is something that happened, that was born in a specific moment in time in the late 18th century. And I think this is important to be remembered when we think about the future of nation states within Europe, that there's nothing natural about it, although now we tend to put them in a sort of pedestal as associated with things like democracy or the rule of law. So that's one thing that I think is very important to be reminded. I think when it comes to the European Union, I think for them, nation states are something awkward, and if the European Union finds itself in an awkward position because it is a supranational entity, but its existence depends on the support of its member states that are all established nation states. Now, I'm a historian, so I look at the past and I don't predict the future. But if there's one thing that I noticed from the past is that Europeans have rejected centralization in both its national and European form. And I believe that they will continue to do so. So if there's a move towards decentralization, I think it's likely that, well, two things may happen. One is a fragmentation of nation states, be it Scotland or Catalonia or something or another part of Europe. I think that's possible. So there may be a move towards a Europe of more nation states, and in other parts of Europe where they may be where states may be more centralized, or where nationalist movements may not be as strong, we may see a stronger role of regions. And in both these cases, I think at some point, because the world is what it is, because it's so global, because competition is not local, not even European, but it's international, I think these entities will ask for the help of the European Union, or however it will be called at that point. And that's because, and that's why I said earlier, I think the European Union needs to be prepared to give an answer, as it wasn't prepared in the past. Last we've seen with Catalonia, when uprisings happened, Catalonians asked for help to the European Union, and the European Union supported the Spanish government. And I think we can all be sympathetic to that. I think it was a very tough position to be in, but that was again a very last minute unprepared answer. And I think whatever happens in the future, whether it's going to be a future still of nation states or something different, the relationship between the European Union and nation states is complicated, and the European Union needs to be ready to give an answer. Well, I simply think that minority nationalisms threaten the status quo of the Europe of nation states. And because of that, every time there's a people within an established nation state that raises concerns about its own identity, states become quite nervous about it, and they try and dismiss it as, I don't know, economic concerns or something similar. And I think, I think that's complicated, because if people have mere economic concerns, they take on the streets, they build barricades, but they don't start building, claims about a national identity. So although, I've said earlier that nations and national identities are very much invented, there is something there, and I think it's not okay to just dismiss it as a mere economic problem, because there's something cultural, there's something deeper that that needs to be taken into account. And I'm a bit wary when I hear, as it happened in the Spanish case, that states associate the rule of law and democracy on the one hand with the nation on the other. As I was saying earlier, we're so used to Western nation states as representing democracy that we kind of almost use these words as synonyms. And it makes me uncomfortable, because I think that inherent to the idea of nation, there are concepts of assimilation and uniformity that are not the same thing as integration. And I'm not entirely sure that these concepts are entirely democratic. So that's just something to think about. I think it's quite hard to generalize. I think perhaps something that can be said is that the European Union is often seen as a potential savior, as an alternative to the nation state, because it's very clear that these minority nationalisms, if they were to succeed and become established nation states, they would be small, they would need some support. So for sure, they would want to be part of the European Union. And I think that they would hope that in their struggle to national sovereignty, the European Union would support them. We're seeing it to an extent also in Scotland, although that things are a bit different, of course, because of the four nations that form the United Kingdom. And in that sense, I think the European Union has disappointed them. And as I was saying earlier, it's a tough position for the European Union. And that's why I think those talks are really important to have. But one thing that is also true of the European Union, in at least in the Basque Country, is that thanks to Schengen, the relationships between the French and the Spanish Basque Country became much tighter, because there was no border there, when there had been a border since, in modern times, since it had been established in the 1850s. So somehow the European Union and its policies helped bringing the two sides closer together. Again, that was not necessarily a something that was meant to happen, but it certainly helped. But more generally, I think, yes, there tends to be some hope on the part of these minority nationalisms that the European Union may support their claim. to independence. This hasn't happened yet, but we'll see what happens in the future. Given Brexit, the Scottish case now seems a bit different in that respect, but we'll see what happens. I think that Europe does have a shared history. The problem is that the narrative that it presents at the moment is not as strong as that of nation states. And I think part of the problem is that the narrative that tries to establish is very much on the same premises as the nation state, as a narrative of nations. So, shared history, shared traditions, etc. It's not trying to implement something new, and that new, I wouldn't know what it could be. But I think part of the problem is that it's just a reshuffling together of the same ideas, and already we've seen with all these minority nationalisms and regionalisms, etc., that we were talking about earlier, how difficult it is for nation states, even relatively small one, to build one coherent narrative and to do the same with an entire continent that certainly has commonalities, but is also very different for obvious geographical reasons. I think it's going to be difficult, and I just don't necessarily think that that's the way to go. I don't think that you want to create a big, like massive nation, again, we're trying to avoid that. I think it just I think the sense of belonging shouldn't come from thinking that we're all the same, or we all, share enough things to consider ourselves belonging to a European nation. It's a question of be sensible and be rational and realize that we are better together than alone in this world. There's a distinction between national identity and nationalism. National identity can be cultural and, relatively harmless. The problem starts when you want to apply something political to that national identity, that cultural identity, because then you start pitching yourself against other nation states. And when that happens, then, it leads to, in our world, to populism and to conflicts, non-military conflicts between nation states. But in the past, we've seen that, it led to major wars. And I think that's what the European Union has tried to avoid by its own existence. But the seeds of the problem remain there as long as nationalism as a political movement still exists. So I personally think that the only way of solving the problem is just to eradicate nationalism as a political form of national identity completely.